Saludos, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a la conferencia magistral de la Semana del Economista 2021. Durante la semana hemos tenido una diversidad de discusión de temas y le agradecemos a todos y a todas por su apoyo a la Asociación de Economistas de Puerto Rico, a este primer evento virtual de una semana completa. Luego de esta conferencia, les espero en los trabajos de nuestra primera asamblea virtual para la dedicatoria póstuma del economista y pasado presidente Antonio L. Rosado Santiago, Papo, y donde seleccionaremos la nueva Junta de Directores. Ahora les paso con el moderador, el doctor Héctor Tavárez Vargas, para presentar al invitado y dar comienzo a la conferencia. Thank you, Dr. Loomis and Dr. Tavárez. Adelante.
Gracias. Pues buenos días a todos. Mi nombre es Héctor Tavárez y voy a ser el moderador en este foro, como menciona la doctora Alba Brugueras. Voy a dar la bienvenida formalmente en un momento en inglés, pero quería dar las instrucciones rápido en español. Hoy tenemos el privilegio de tener al doctor John Loomis presentando sobre el tema de economía de los recursos. En caso de preguntas o comentarios, pueden dejarlas por escrito en la sección de Q&A que está a la parte de abajo de la ventana de Zoom. Por lo que podemos traer sus preguntas a discusión de tenerla al final de su presentación. Para evitar complicaciones durante la presentación, preferimos que escriba sus preguntas directamente en inglés. El doctor Loomis va a presentar por aproximadamente 40 minutos y luego vamos a tener la sección de preguntas y respuestas. ¿Okay? Así que, good morning, everyone. My name is Héctor Tavárez, Associate Professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics and Rural Sociology of the University of Puerto Rico and Mayagüez. Today, I will be the moderator of the forum. We are pleased to have Dr. John Loomis presenting today the last presentation, which will be on resource economics. His presentation is the last one of a series of presentations during this week before the annual meeting of the Puerto Rico Economists Association. The title of his presentation is Non-Market Economic Values, Example of Recreation in El Yunque and Use in Decision-Making in the U.S. Dr. John Loomis has been a professor in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics at Colorado State University for 27 years. He's the author or co-author of 5 books, including Valuing U.S. National Parks and Programs, Integrated Public Lands Management, Environmental Policy Analysis for Decision-Making, Recreation Economic Decisions, 2nd edition, and Determining the Economic Value of Water, 2nd edition. He has also published more than 250 journal articles dealing with economic valuation of non-market and natural resources, such as recreational fishing and other recreation, including travel cost models of hiking, mountain biking, and kayaking. His research includes contingent valuation of wilderness, endangered species, public lands, wetlands, and water quality. He is a distinguished scholar of the Western Agricultural Economics Association, a fellow of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economists, and a fellow of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. Prior to coming to Colorado State University, Dr. Loomis was an associate professor at the University of California, Davis. Please welcome Dr. John Loomis.
Good morning, folks, and thanks for joining us for this seminar. And we'll go to the next slide here. So this is kind of an overview, and it provides, what are non-market goods, what are the types of economic values, and then we'll look at contingent valuation in more detail, as it's a commonly used way to measure these use and non-use values of non-market goods. And then we'll look at, I've got a case study from Puerto Rico, a couple of those from work I've done down there. One with University of Puerto Rico, and then look at a couple of the dam removal projects here in the US, and then there'll be time, of course, for question answer. So, what are some of the types of these, economic values? And, a big one, worldwide is estimating the economic value to people of improving air quality from a human health standpoint, as well as drinking water quality. So, early on, the initial valuation work was done on recreation and everything from beaches to hiking, backpacking, and so forth. And there's two types of non-use values. So for people that in fact may never set foot in the area or may never consume these non-market goods, nonetheless, they may be willing to pay just to know the resource exists, and if it's protected today, to have it for future generations. So that's the bequest value, is their willingness to pay to, pat on this protected natural resource to their, children, grandchildren, and future generations. And when we have the total value of the use and non-use, economists call that, sort of total economic value, and that's been around for a while. And it includes the recreation use value or any other use values such as the air quality, for example, option value for future uses, and again, what people would pay for that, and these existence and bequest values, which economists originally called non-use values, but in fact the courts called them passive use values in terms of legitimate values to include for valuing damages originally with like the Exxon Valdez oil spill in Alaska, and more recently the British Petroleum BP spill in the Gulf of Mexico. So taken together, these provide a complete measure. Now, not every natural resource involves all of these values, and sometimes, like in the case of, deer hunting, there's lots of deer in most states in the United States, and the resource primarily has value to hunters or viewers. So recreation value would be the biggest value. But in some cases, like the benefit of reducing these oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico, and particularly in Alaska, most of the benefits are bequest and existence value because very few people go up there. And in some cases, many people may in fact have a zero economic value for all of these. There's nothing in economic theory that suggests people have to have a positive willingness to pay, in fact, for all of these goods, any more than I don't have to pay for cauliflower, for example. Now, how do we measure this total economic value or use and values for improving air quality, for example? Economists use the same thing we've been using to measure the benefits of electricity, gasoline, clothing, automobiles for decades. So it's the area under that demand curve, the familiar consumer surplus or the Hicksian compensating variation. So non-market valuation to make those monetary values consistent with the cost, consistent with how we measure the benefits for market goods, and we use the same economic concepts. So we haven't invented any new economic concepts. What's unique to non-market valuation is that how we measure those is in fact more challenging because we don't have an explicit market price. So as most of you know, price is the kind of willingness to pay at the margin for one more unit, but the consumer surplus is the willingness to pay for all the inframarginal units. And in some cases, we take the area between demand curves as a measure of willingness to pay to improve quality, whether it's the quality of computers, television sets, automobiles, miles per gallon, and so forth. So, there's nothing unusual about what we're trying to measure. What's unusual is how we have to measure that, since these are non-market values. So in one sense, in an urban setting, we do have prices that are bundled together with other resources. So in this case, house prices. And at least most of the time, real estate agents, say location, location, location. That's a large factor in what determines the house price. And so houses, of course, and Puerto Rico, I'm sure house prices or condominium prices, near the beach or with a view of the beach sell for more than, those that don't. Holding, the size of the house and the characteristics of the house constant. And so we can use, again, a standard multiple regression, just like, the standard econometric approach to estimate and isolate the amount that the view of the beach or beachfront property contributes to the house price, holding everything else constant. And, the same approach has been used not only for beaches, but for lakes and, air quality and a variety of natural resources. So that works good in an urban setting. Oftentimes, when we're out in rural areas, like for example, El Yunque, that we're going to talk about, one approach there in those areas where there's not an explicit price to visit a picnic site is to use variations in visitors' travel cost, and in some cases travel time, to trace out that demand curve. So there's no market price, or in some cases like Loquillo Beach, the price is an administratively set fee, and it doesn't reflect visitors' willingness to pay. So we use that variation in the travel costs arising from the fact that people live at different distances from the site. And once we, again, econometrically, using the same type of multiple regression, we can estimate a demand curve. From the demand curve, of course, we can calculate consumer surplus. So those are the two what are called revealed preference methods, where we do have some behavior that is observable through these what's sometimes called related markets. But there are cases where there's a change in environmental quality that's yet to be observed, or these non-use values where there's little observable behavior. So in the case of the dam removal studies that I've been involved in, the benefits of not having the dam there are not observable because the dam is still there. So we can't use the travel cost method, for example. So we construct a simulated market, or kind of a pseudo market, or a voter referendum. Again, in the United States, the continental part, Puerto Rico's part of the United States. And I don't know, there in Puerto Rico, if you have school bond issues to pay for the funding of schools, but we have them here in the state of Colorado, where I'm from. And, we're asked to vote. In fact, my wife and I did this last night on increasing the taxes on our house to pay for better quality schools in terms of paying teachers more, hiring more teachers. So, these are realistic. People actually do vote in real life on these. And so what we're trying to do in our contingent valuation method surveys is basically, simulate that, structure a voter referendum or structure a simulated market. And basically, much like a voter referendum, as you'll see, ask people how they would vote at different prices. So here's our one of the applications of contingent valuation that we did, that I did with Luis Santiago, who was at UPR there and now in Florida. And as part of a larger project funded by the National Science Foundation, we needed to know the economic value to people of visiting, these three rivers. And in particular, how that valuation, let's see, did I get, okay, no. And another element, and we'll get back to the Rio Mamea study in a minute. This other Rio Mamea study was, as you can tell by the 1995 date, was done during the very significant drought in 1995. And there was a proposal to dam or develop the Rio Mameas to divert water from it in such a manner as one of the last free-flowing rivers. So we did a contingent valuation survey there, and that was used by the Forest Service, for example, in the decision about how water could be diverted down at the very end before it reaches the ocean without building a dam. Now, the study of the Mameas and Fajardo and Espiritu Santo, that one we'll talk about here in terms of these natural features of waterfalls as well as trail construction and what that adds to the value. And again, we use contingent valuation. So the Forest Service that manages El Yunque was in fact interested, about the value of recreation and particularly the value of changes with waterfalls, because again, water diversion can reduce the flows over the waterfalls, and certainly construction and maintenance of hiking trails there. It's a rainforest, and so the Forest Service is having to constantly, rebuild these trails, for example. So what does it cost to construct the trail and maintain it? That's the cost side. The benefit side then is how much does having these hiking trails add to the value of the trip? So again, we use, regression analysis. We've got willingness to pay as the dependent variable. And then A are these attributes of the site, the characteristics of the site. So in some sense, it's not too much different in some ways than a household production function, right? We've got attributes or characteristics. And one of those is the waterfall. One of those is hiking trails or foot trails. And then we control for gender, age, education, and income. So we ask this question as what we call a closed-ended question. So we ask them if the cost of visiting the river, today, if it was increased by a dollar amount, you can see down there anywhere from $1 to $200, would you have come today? And you pick the low end, $1, to make, have in one sense, you're trying to get a well-defined intercept of the horizontal and vertical intercept. So you want a dollar amount low enough that everybody says yes to it, and a dollar amount high enough that everybody says no to it. And that way you get, as they say, the vertical and horizontal intercepts, estimated with some precision. So we asked that question of a large sample of people with these dollar amounts that vary across the sample. So that's the key. Each person only gets asked $1 amount. So it's very market-like in that sense. Here's the price. Would you come at that price or not? And, this is our sample design. We had the 3 rivers, and we had, again, in good econometric design, we had variations across these sites. So we had waterfalls, views, and then the number of trails. And then with those responses, this is the model we estimate. So a logit model, in the same family, these qualitative response models, in this case, a binary model, logit, and in the same group of statistical models as the probit model. And so we estimate that, and we get an intercept, and most importantly is B1, the coefficient on the dollar variable. And then, X is the dollar amount we ask them to pay. And then once again, we've got the attributes and the demographics. Now we're going to key in on these variables. And all of these are statistically significant at the 10% level or higher. Now at the bottom of the slide is kind of the take-home message on this particular application. And that is one way to make sure that what people say they would pay, does that conform or is that consistent to, economic principles. So as in this case, right, we have a negative and significant coefficient on that dollar amount. So the higher the dollar amount people are asked to pay, the lower the probability they would pay. So, that in fact is consistent with downward sloping demand curves. So we feel pretty good that in fact people took the dollar amount seriously, even if they didn't have to hand over $200 or hand over 15, 20, whatever dollar amount they were asked to pay. But nonetheless, they were paying attention to that. They took it seriously. And as the dollar amount increased, their value or the amount, the likelihood of saying yes went down. So here we got the net economic value with the trails of $96, with trails and waterfalls, the higher trip value. And then we were able to get at the incremental value, just isolate the value that waterfalls contribute and trails contribute. So this is useful to the Forest Service and useful in dealing with others. And as I say, in some of the states in the US, these waterfalls, either for producing hydropower or diverting water for hydropower, it's a conflicting or competing use. And the forest, used to be called CNF, Caribbean National Forest. It's expensive to build these trails, and it's expensive to provide parking and trash collection. So it helps the Forest Service justify, budget requests to Congress in many cases. So how is this information used in decision making? People often ask me, is this information, do people use it? And I always kid people, well, I used it to get tenure, and so that counts as a use. But in fact, it really helps dispel this kind of myth that it's, the economy versus the environment, that we have to make this trade-off. In fact, water for, bird habitat, for example, versus water diversions for people in Los Angeles, people value both of those. And so this CVM study I did when I was at University of California, Davis, really changed the nature of that debate and trade-off in the case of keeping water for these migratory birds in Mono Lake. And while that was an academic study, the state of California said, that's very useful type of information, and we're going to conduct, a much larger, sort of policy analysis to be used in these EISs, which are environmental impact statements. And in fact, that was a contributing, this information contributing to the decision to reduce the amount of water that the city of Los Angeles could divert from the lake, so there'd be a sufficient amount of water for the birds. So this was a factor, air quality. As the lake went down, it caused a lot of dust. That was a factor as well. A big one, and many of you, of course, heard of the Grand Canyon. There's a large dam up above the Grand Canyon. And in fact, that dam, the way it was operated for peaking hydropower, that when people in Phoenix, Arizona turned on their air conditioners, they released more water from the dam. On Sunday morning, when there was no industry going, no it was cool. They almost shut water down from the dam. Well, that had real adverse detrimental effects on endangered fish there in the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon, as well as rafting, which, you know, was a sort of world-class rafting through the Grand Canyon. And so the Secretary of Interior in the federal government cited the results of the contingent valuation, particularly on the passive use values, those existence and bequest values, to justify in what's called the record of decision that comes with the environmental impact statement, to say, no, we're going to change how the flows out of Glen Canyon Dam are managed to protect the endangered fish and the quality of rafting. So they reduced how much water gets released at peak times and increased it at what's called off-peak times to have a more even, steady flow of water, even though the value of the hydropower produced was less because you weren't providing that hydropower when there was a lot of demand in the afternoon when people came home from work and turned on their air conditioner. So, you know, that's a very clear-cut case that this information and even contingent valuation of passive use values was used in decision-making. Now, the federal government also uses contingent valuation to estimate the damages associated with these large oil spills and even old mining sites. So the state of Alaska used contingent valuation with to, you know, like basically fine, assess damages or a penalty to Exxon for, in fact, the damages that this oil tanker called the Valdez that resulted in a spill that killed lots of wildlife there in Alaska. Same way with the recent British petroleum spill in the Gulf of Mexico. Again, the states and the federal government all did contingent valuation to estimate the damages to their citizens, right? I mean, the biologists have to calculate how many fish died and how many birds died. And then from that, the economists used that to survey the public, again with contingent valuation, and get the value so that beyond the cost of cleanup, that was part of the fine or damages that British Petroleum was liable for and had to make, you know, monetary contributions. The same way in this Clark Fork River in Montana, you know, the mining company had to pay to clean up the damage that was flowing out of this mine into the Clark Fork River, and again, killing fish. Now, a couple of the larger studies that, you know, I've been involved in, when they're looking at doing dam removal, these agencies, this is a big, expensive, important decision, controversial one. And so as part of the environmental impact statement, they've had these contingent valuation studies done on what the public will pay to remove these dams, you know, one on the Elwha River up by Seattle, Washington, another one on the Klamath River, kind of in southern Oregon. And likewise in the Lower Snake River in eastern Washington, to remove 4 dams there to get a free-flowing river. And there, we just looked at the potential recreation that would be gained using what's called more of a contingent visitation. And we were not allowed to measure the total economic value or those passive use values. So when people ask me, gee, does anybody take these values seriously? I've had this study, that passive use contingent valuation part of the study stopped by a federal US senator from Washington who was opposed to the dam removal, that was concerned that these passive use values would show very large values and it would make it harder to stop, the dam removal. Same way I've had another study in the state of Wyoming stopped by the ranchers who were concerned about public values for reducing livestock grazing to protect wildlife and water quality. So, the people opposed to some protection of the environment certainly takes these studies, in fact, seriously. So, generally speaking, they are taken seriously. Generally speaking, agencies like EPA, in fact, are required to do these studies as part of their benefit cost analysis on environmental regulations. Likewise, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that do flood control study, they're required to do benefit cost analysis. There they include recreation use values. So the agencies, use, in some cases are required to use non-market valuation. In other cases, they choose to use non-market valuation unless they're stopped by outsiders like US senators who say, no, we don't want these done. So with that, I'll be happy to entertain questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Loomis, for your presentation. We have a few minutes for questions and answers from the audience. The first question we have is, after the pandemic and the economic crisis, do you think that willingness to pay to visit these rivers have changed?
Yes, now again, we've got to separate out, right? Prices change in the sense of inflation, right? So we do, if we're comparing studies over time, adjust for inflation, so they're in constant dollars. So let's see here. So, basically, that element, but people have done studies where even adjusted for inflation, for example, recreation use values have increased over time. In part, demand has increased, particularly relative to supply. So in many cases, the supply of national parks, for example, are pretty fixed. And, population increases demand just like it does for any other product. So, the relative values of many of these things have increased, but recreation is one that's well documented.
All right, thank you. Another question, could you please explain how economic valuation studies can be used in cost-benefit analysis?
Sure. So, in cost benefit analysis, right, we need the value of all the benefits, market and non-market, right? I always kid people, right? We're economists, not accountants. We're not interested in doing a financial analysis. We want to do an economic analysis that includes any public goods or externalities, whether it's beneficial or negative externalities. And so the non-market values, provide a measure of those benefits that go into, if you think of a benefit cost ratio, right, go into the numerator. If they're good things that are produced, whether purposely, like water quality, or in fact, are sort of what you might call beneficial externalities or public goods that come when you take some other actions, for example. And they could end up being, there's non-market cost in some cases. So if there's, you're building or expanding, for example, a power plant, in the denominator, right, is the cost, and that would be the market cost to build the power plant. But it would also be, the cost of air pollution, in terms of human health considerations. And so, you might be comparing, alternatives, and in the benefit cost analysis, right, you're always comparing the future with and the future without across alternatives. And so one alternative might be, okay, let's do renewables, after some of the recent hurricanes in Puerto Rico, right, there was an increasing emphasis on renewables and, disaggregated geographically electricity production. So you're doing a benefit cost analysis on, should the Commonwealth invest in renewables, either through some sort of incentive program versus let's build another power plant. In Puerto Rico, as I recall, they're either produced by oil or in some cases by hydropower. So if you're comparing those, there's non-market benefits and cost, and any of those non-market values would be valued using the techniques we talked about, and those benefits and costs would be added into, the market benefits of the electricity, and even electricity reliability has been valued using contingent valuation, what people would pay to have fewer outages of electricity.
Great, thank you very much for your explanation. We have a few more questions here. Before we continue, could you please hit the button to stop sharing your screen, possible?
Okay, can you see it or not see it right now?
I can't see it. We can see it, but if you stop sharing your screen, I think we can also see you.
Can you see it now at all? Okay, now let me go back then.
There you go. Okay.
Okay, start right.
We have the next question is, to be clear, the payment vehicle used for the Junta study was some sort of travel expenditure?
No, so we did contingent valuation there. So that's this question. Now, we actually tried to do a travel cost model. In fact, Luis and I, so we've done a couple travel cost models and actually compared them to contingent valuation. And one of the challenges of doing a travel cost model in Puerto Rico is that because it's an island, it sets an upper bound, a small island. It sets an upper bound on how far people can travel, and hence the vertical intercept of that demand curve. So it was interesting, and we kind of investigated this, and a student, I think, included some of this in their dissertation, because if you think of the state of Colorado, it's a big state, or the state of California. And, if you think of Yosemite, right, people come from all across the country. So there's a lot of variation in travel costs, but there's a limit in how much variation you can get in Puerto Rico by the, maximum size of the island. So while we collected data to do both, and we actually estimated both, we felt that the contingent valuation responses were a more accurate reflection of maximum willingness to pay, right? And that's what we, in most cases, want is, okay, what's the maximum willingness to pay? So I hope that helps.
Yes, I think that makes sense. Probably otherwise you will have to include those visitors from foreign countries, tourists, to probably that will increase the precision of the estimates. Yeah,
and for most of these rivers, these are locally used. El Yunque, I guess, draws people, and then tourists and people from, like myself, from Colorado. But, then we also go to Luquillo Beach, and you've got these what are called multi-destination trips or multi-purpose trips. And so, that makes separating out, okay, what's the travel cost to go to the Rio Mamayas as distinct from my travel cost and trip costs from the US to go to Luquillo Beach. And we would double count if we go, okay, well, how much did you spend on airfare to get here? And we count it for Luquillo Beach because there's somebody else surveying there versus a different person and group surveying at the Rio Mamayas.
All right, thank you. Next question, how should we use economic valuation studies to convince stakeholders or the government to create environmental conservation policies, especially when the country or municipality is not that involved in conservation initiatives?
Right, and this where you may have to help me out. There is a Commonwealth Department of Natural Resources, as I recall. And then, of course, so I think, like Luquillo Beach, I think is more of a Commonwealth, or maybe it's provincial, Commonwealth government. And then you have sites that are, maybe associated with just the town, like, Fajardo, for example. And so, sometimes it takes time, right? It took time in the US, states like Idaho and Montana, to get the states to adopt non-market valuation. So, it does take time for them to basically realize what these techniques are and the usefulness of them. And, much like computers or anything else, right? To get agencies to go from pencil and paper to computers, that didn't happen overnight. It took, a decade or more. And so I think in some cases, it takes this kind of outreach. It takes communication with the stakeholders. Environmental groups back in the 1960s, 70s, and early 1980s were opposed to non-market valuation. They thought it was unethical that you're placing a price on nature, and nature was priceless. Sort of how dare you do, estimate an economic value. And so, but, 10, 15 years later, environmental groups and conservation groups hired economists to do non-market valuation, including one of my students. So, as I say, it takes a lot of education over time to educate and show this is a tool. Now, it shouldn't be used in every case. Some situations, it in fact is not appropriate. So, but it's another tool to improve our benefit cost analysis and to capture values that are otherwise, far more subjective. And as I say, you have these debates that it's the economy versus the environment, and that kind of results in a stalemate. Nobody moves, and it's just who's the biggest bully in that case.
Yes, and I guess one of the reasons we assign a dollar amount or value to the environment is precisely because we use it in cost benefit analysis. So we have to compare benefits against the cost or versus the cost. So it will make sense to use a dollar amount as a unit to measure the value of environmental ecosystem services or environmental non-market goods and services. But I have been in some conferences where, yes, people complain about why we use a dollar value to measure, to evaluate any environmental concern or problem.
Yeah, it's taken the folks that do hydropower, private hydropower things, decades to come around from, and in some cases it's, till some of these people retire. In some cases, economists retire that were trained, 40, 50 years ago. And, it was like, markets, are the only thing that matter. So when they retire or die, and the folks that come in or have had more recent training and education, they go, oh, we should be doing this.
Yes, I think education is one of the main keywords here. Unfamiliar, people are not familiar with this type of techniques often. So, but yes, I think we have the last question here. How will you exactly use your results from a Junta for conservation-related policies? So I guess the question is how, if you have to use it to convince stakeholders about something, how will you use it exactly?
So, part of the reason we were doing that study, for example, there were two reasons. The earlier study in 1995, the Forest Service wanted to show in this debate was, should water be diverted? The drought was real serious in Puerto Rico. And, the Rio Mameas was seen as a source of water. And, the usual engineering approach is let's build a dam. And, biologists were not, and the Forest Service was not happy about that. And so one of the non-market values, or a non-market value, or the dominant one, was, okay, well, what's the value to the public, not just the recreation use value, but what was the value to Puerto Rico and, the citizens of Puerto Rico in terms of, protecting the last free-flowing river there. So, it got used in the, debate on that. And, the Forest Service pointed that, to that value, saying it's not just an environmental value, it, in fact, has economic value. The follow-up study on recreation use of the Espiritu Santo and the Rio Mameas was partly an NS National Science Foundation project, because there was concern that all the recreation was adversely affecting, there's a freshwater shrimp that's fairly rare and not found in many other places. And so there was a concern. The biologists who've been studying the shrimp were really worried that all this recreation use not only had a physical impact, right? People were out there physically in the river, but in fact, with all the little kids and so forth, and all the sediment being stirred up, and the little kids peeing in the river, that the water quality was being adversely affected. And that was having a detrimental effect on the shrimp. And so the two studies, the biology was being done, and we did water quality monitoring at these sites with recreation use as compared to sites without. And again, that was an input to the Forest Service, right? They manage these rivers. And so should they reduce or even eliminate recreation use, and what would be the cost, right? The non-market cost, the opportunity cost in some respects of reducing recreation if it was having an adverse effect on the shrimp. Well, luckily, in fact, the recreation use wasn't adversely affecting water quality as compared to the water quality upstream of the recreation sites. The water quality in upstream and below where recreation use was taking place was not significantly different. So, it wasn't, it turned out not to be after the fact, a few years late after, when we were doing these studies, the result of the studies were, okay, it turns out there's not a trade-off. And so, the economic values, were not critical except to the Forest Service for budget requests for building trails and trail maintenance. So it was useful to the Forest Service for budgetary justifications, but it turned out, thank goodness, there wasn't a trade-off of, okay, the Forest Service is going to have to compare the benefits of recreation foregone to what are the biological benefits of the shrimp.
All right. I'm pretty sure we can keep talking about this for hours. It's a very interesting topic. But we need
just
to,
you and I and Alba, probably.
We need to start with our annual meeting of the association. So thank you very much, Dr. Loomis, for your presentation. I am convinced that this is a topic of interest to the audience today. We need to do more studies like this in Puerto Rico for sure. And we need to disseminate this type of results with stakeholders across the island too. Thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. Have a nice day.
Okay, you folks have a nice weekend.